So, welcome to Men in Balance. Today we have a special guest, Bill Wilder, and Bill is involved in therapy for men, and among other things. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Jerry.
So, maybe you could start by talking in general about what it is that you do at the Wellness Center and how you got into that, and then we could talk about some specifics.
Sounds great. Yeah, I've been a therapist for about 15 years. I've worked a lot with families and men and teenagers. And one of my passions has been to try to figure out how to blend spirituality and psychology. I went to seminary, studied divinity, studied marriage and family therapy, and I've been on a long quest to try to crack the code. And over the last couple of years, I've been getting into cold water, and I found that cold water is one of the best ways for people to tap into their body. And if you're like me, I tend to live in my head a lot of times, and I needed some way to actually learn to meditate. And I found that getting in cold water stopped all thinking, because the only way to actually stay still and do it is to go inside, go deep inside yourself. And I found it to be extremely enlightening to be able to do that. And I started incorporating it, into my own personal work. And then I started taking people into Lake Norman in the mornings when it was cold. And I just saw all these amazing things happening. So I was like, I need to start a center. I need to start a place where people can have access to this on a regular basis, because it was truly a revelation to me and to the people I was working with.
So, you mean cold water as in ice water, or just in routine cold waters in the lake, or what?
50-degree water, like in the wintertime, the lake gets down to about 48 degrees. And to make yourself get in cold water, it's an act of the will. And we've in our culture, we've lost touch with our instincts. We've lost touch with our body. We've gotten so wrapped up in technology that we need initiatory practices. We need challenges. And cold water is not only medically really good for you, it's also psychologically, it's a good challenge. Because when you get in it, it feels like little bee stings. But the cool thing is once you start getting in it, you start getting into your breath, the body begins to relax. And the more you relax, the less it hurts. And then the more the fire builds within you. It's very empowering. And literally to a point where you can warm your body up. I was in Poland studying with Wim Hof this past January, and on our first day in Poland, they were like, all right, and it was at night, and it was like dark, and they were like, all right, it's time to go. Go into the creeks. The creeks there were freezing, and we would do all these things to tap into that primitive animal, that ancestral man that we've kind of lost touch with. And I remember on the way there, I found this place within me where I was out of my thinking, and I roared into the water and sat there for about 20 minutes and didn't feel much of anything. I felt very calm, and it was a moment of a breakthrough, because I realized, wow, the limits of my mind, I was able to do that. And then it gave me confidence in other areas. And it became just a template or a reference point now to face life like the ice, which is to run toward your fear instead of fall back from it.
So you run the Wellness Center in Mooresville, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how did you get started with that, and what part of your practice is, would you say, devoted to men?
Most of the guys who come in, most of the people who come in are men. Lots of men who are at a place where they're successful, they're giving, they're just feeling stagnant. They're feeling like they just need a reset, that they need to reset their life. And so they'll come see us, and they're usually it's either adolescents or people in mid-age, but it's usually at a time of transition, where it's time to move to that next stage, but they're kind of spinning their wheels. And they're usually struggling with some sort of pain point with purpose, their life purpose, or their intimate relationships, or the combination of both. And they just need a way to figure out in an intensive way why they keep doing the same thing, getting the same results. And I've found that a lot of times people cannot address those things just going 1 hour a week for 6 months, that they need a retreat-like format that's really intensive, where the team comes around you and really helps you to go on a spiritual odyssey into yourself.
My experience with men is that the thing that trips them up the most is relationships. I mean, they just don't seem to get it. She's always asking for more or different or something than he's able to give, and
Yes.
it's a real trouble spot. I'm just curious what your experience has been in that regard, and given today in this COVID environment, the separations and divorces are way up, and I feel like a lot of that is just relationship stuff that needs to be resolved. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, a lot of times when people come in, the first thing we do is I take people through an assessment, and this assessment is a culmination of all my years of study, and it's pretty basic. It comes down to this point that there is no such thing as mental illness. There's mental hunger. So we need to find what part of you is hungry, what part of you is neglected, what part of you is in the dark. And so what we do an assessment where we look at the four different archetypes that live within all of us. The first one is the explorer. This is the part of us that really wants to be alive, wants to be free, wants to go on a journey. The second is a soldier. This is the part of us that wants to get the job done, so provide, do all those sorts of things. The third is the leader, the part of us that wants to have a purpose, and the last is a giver, the part of us that wants love. So love, purpose, structure, stability, and freedom. We have to figure out which of these archetypes, which of these parts of us, almost as if, like, imagine they're different people within you. Usually people have two that are overfed and two that are underfed. So we have to figure out, so to help people become whole in relationships, they must first become whole within themselves. So that's the first step, is to figure out where there's a hunger that needs to be fed.
So talk a little more about that. I mean, where do you go with a man who's just not in touch with himself at all, or has never really looked inside himself, doesn't know how to do much of an introspective view?
Yeah, lots of times the guys who come in here who are like you just described, they're very well in touch with their soldier, with getting the job done, being responsible. They're in touch with their leader. They're a leader at work. They're reasonable. They're able to juggle all the balls of family, work, those things. But what they've lost touch with is their heart, their feelings, and their bodily instincts. They're so locked in their head, they don't know how to be present. They don't know how to relax and settle. And so a lot of the work that we do, our specialization is really helping men tap into their hearts again, tap into not just saying, hey, you need to talk like this or communicate like this, because I've done traditional marriage therapy, and a lot of times when you just tell people to use certain communication techniques, if it's not coming from an open heart, it's really not very natural, and it doesn't really flow outside of facilitation. So we try to help people really tap into their hearts, be honest, speak your truth. What do you think? What do you feel? What do you need? And a lot of times that's the most important question, is, can you tell me what you feel, what you think, what you want, what you need? Just start there. If we can just get that truth out, then some of these hungry parts of us will come to the light, and that there will be at least a 40% shift in behavior. Because sometimes we're just so locked up because we're hiding. We're not meant to hide.
Well, the assumption, as you're talking, though, is that men are willing to get into a therapy session or counseling session, and that seems to be the difficult part. I mean, they are just scared to death of a counseling session because they're going to have to open up and
yeah, that's a really good thing. The way I do it is I try to avoid the storytelling aspect where you have to just spill the beans in all your story. And I have a very unique system where literally I can just look at some boards. I have a bunch of boards on a wall, and we literally circle feelings across a spectrum of different modalities. And then I'm able to looking at these different boards, identify exactly where a person is stuck. And then we take it to the team, and then we create a plan, and then we pinpoint. So we actually avoid overly talking. I think that traditional psychotherapy, if it's so focused on just using the mind, there's going to be limits to how much transformation can happen. So I find that I'm trying to get people back to their body, back to their breath, back to their heart again. And then, but we do find what needs to be looked at intellectually very quickly.
Um, you know, my experience is that, contrary to what you were just talking about, men feel like they are dragged into therapy by their partner, and they got the dragger and the draggy, and so they get there and they look inside themselves. They don't see anything to talk about, or else they just
Yeah.
feel just totally out of place. And I guess that troubles me, that men don't know more about themselves, or are not more in touch with themselves on a regular basis, and that just seems to be a natural thing.
Yeah, a lot of the guys that come here to the center are at a place where the like what we do here, one of our main tenets is we're here to awaken the fire within. So our premise is not necessarily to do traditional therapy, like go back and look at your past, but it's more like, are you burned out? Have you lost touch with that a playful boy in you, that a part of you that's able to be courageous and run towards your fear? So a lot of the guys that come here are like hungry for that. So that's kind of the way we kind of get them to engage them. Like, do you want to feel fully alive? Tap into those primitive instincts. And people are like, yes, please. I am a drone. I want to feel alive again. So that's kind of the angle I take, is to do that. But then through the back door, the only way to really embody that primitive, you have to tap into your heart. You have to be vulnerable. You have to be humble. You have to lay down your burdens. And that's also what our staff does. We have a master spiritual director who is a trained, she's trained in spiritual direction. She's a shaman. She's trained in South America, and she is very, very, her name is Amanda. Her ability to pinpoint where the blockage is and to help people release the grief. And a lot of it's, her specialty is grief. A lot of men have so much locked up sadness and grief, and they need a way to let it out. And the cold water is definitely pulls it out, because it almost like pulls out trauma. And then after the cold, you're opened up, and then you meet with Amanda, and then she really goes in and really pulls out stuff more. So that's it's a really different approach than go sit on a couch and be forced to talk to some stranger.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you went into the spiritual stuff, because that's where I wanted to go next. I mean,
Yeah.
My experience with men is that they are very wary of their own spiritual nature. They just don't trust it. They
Yeah.
feel like out of place even talking about it. And yet it's so critical to being a whole person. How do you work with that in therapy?
That's a good question. We take a more, all of life is spiritual, so we kind of don't think of it in terms of it's about going to church or just trying morality. And really the first thing people do when they come to the center is we do this exercise. It's a fear setting exercise where after the assessment, where I say, okay, what are some things you want to let go of? What are some fears, some burdens, some thoughts that you want to baptize, you want to let go of? And then I have a board and I'll write down those words. So again, we're not going into deep storytelling, just more like, hey, I want to let go of my guilt, my anger, just whatever it could be. It could be as superficial as you want. And we write that down. And then we go through a whole bunch of exercises where we really tap people into the breath, doing the Wim Hof breathing. Have you heard of Wim Hof, the Iceman?
No, I have not.
From Poland. He's pretty big now, and he's broken a lot of world records, and he cracked a code on anxiety and depression through breath and cold water. Literally, when I was training with him, he made this quote. It totally changed the way I think of how to deal with anxiety, which is an epidemic today. He said, when you find the courage within, the fire within, essentially, the primitive instincts, the messengers of fear will fly away. Now that turns anxiety treatment on its head. Most of the time in traditional therapy, we're trying to manipulate anxiety, talk it out, cognify it, medicate it. But what he was saying is, when you find that fire, that part of you, that strength within you, then you don't have to be as anxious, because now you've got something deep within you that you can root into. So that's the way I think of it, is let's find that part of you, that has no fear, that part of you that can look, that's very similar to the animals in nature, that's able to stare down and look with no fear. then, because I believe that's the next wave of spirituality, is people tapping into that resiliency, that power within them, and then they're able to then live life fluidly and relax and actually walk towards fear and actually make an impact on the world, because they're not living in fear. They're actually living in faith, which is faith in a power beyond themselves that's found within themselves, essentially.
You mentioned the word a few minutes ago, vulnerability, and you
Yeah.
said you got to be willing to be vulnerable. I was speaking to a men's group one time, very early in my work with Men in Balance, and I said, you need to learn to be vulnerable with your wife. This guy came up to me after the session and said, Jerry, you're going to run men off if you ever use that word again. But it's so important. So talk a little bit about what vulnerability means in your.
Yes. Vulnerability is really just learning to be honest and aware of what you're feeling. And so that's kind of the first step of growth. And I think that if your listeners can do just this one thing of just taking some time, taking some breaths, and just you get out a piece of paper and just begin to write what you feel, and just begin to almost imagine that your internal world is like a boardroom, and you're trying to identify. You can even draw a little circle on a piece of paper and say, I've got this anxiety part, I've got this angry part, I've got this little boy in me that's afraid of rejection. And you just begin to identify, almost personify these emotions as if they're people. And when you can do that, it changes everything, because now you're not hiding, and now you're going to be able to actually really, in relationships, a lot of times just being honest and vulnerable goes a long way. You don't most relationship issues aren't fixable. You can't fix so many things, but if you can be honest and vulnerable and humble, that can literally probably solve most issues, at least in the long run.
So really, I mean, another word for it might even be to be genuine. If you can be genuine, be authentic, be yourself.
Yeah. And to really get it, to really step away from the need to not fail. I know that personally, failure for me is a real button. It makes me very anxious whenever I feel like I'm failing somebody or messing up, and I have to really take time to breathe. And what I do, Jerry, is I will, when I feel like my mind is heavy, my heart's heavy, I feel a heaviness, like a real weight on me. I'll breathe. I'll focus between my eyes on the third eye, and I'll breathe. And this is where spirituality comes in. Just focus there, and I'll just remind myself that I've got everything I need within me. And then I'll just kind of talk gently to myself and begin the process of just acknowledging, yeah, wow, I see this. And so I think that kind of a self-dialogue can be a very, very powerful thing. And that is vulnerability. And that's really pretty, that isn't too woo-woo or too therapy. That's just being able to talk to yourself and be honest with yourself.
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned anger in that, because I find that a lot of men are just not in touch with their emotional side much at all. Anger seems okay. We've been taught as men that it's okay to be angry, but it's
Right.
okay to be gentle and kind and vulnerable and all those things. So
Right.
how do you help men deal with anger to get that part of their psyche sort of in place?
Yeah, well, anger is what they know is called a secondary emotion, which means that really anger is a result of something deeper. So I always ask the question, what's the good reason why you're so angry right now? And usually it's a fear of failure, a fear of rejection, a perceived misunderstanding. And then I start there. I don't start with the symptom. I start with the root cause, and really try to help people begin. I think you really have to help people learn to not be ashamed of feeling anxious or feeling weak or feeling scared. And just, if you start there, then I think the anger will slowly dissipate, because you're now getting to the root of the issue.
I know that you spend a fair amount of your time working with men who feel stuck in some way. And
Yes.
that I find is a big barrier for men. I mean, they don't know how to move to the next stage or how to get loose from this thing that's gripping them. Talk a little bit about that, what you see when men come in that state of mind, and what advice you have.
Yes. I believe the chief virtue of all virtues is courage. Even over love, even over joy, even over faith, even any of those things, because when you have the courage to let go of what you're holding on to, when you have the courage to look to speak your truth, to be vulnerable, then that sets the foundation for you to actually become unstuck. So I believe we've forgotten the art of teaching courage in our culture. We've kind of taught we're pretty good at teaching morality. We're pretty good at teaching love. Pretty good at teaching happiness and joy and learning to accept things. But at a foundational level, without courage, you're not going to be able to forgive. You're not going to be able to communicate. You're not going to be able to love in any kind of sustainable way. So I would say that for anybody who's stuck, we need to really feed and work that muscle out of the courage muscle. And it's not just courage for courage's sake. It's the courage to be neutral, the courage to be unattached, the courage to die, the courage to let go, the courage to run into darkness when you don't know what's there, but the courage to do the right thing.
Wow.
And that sometimes is neglected.
Yeah.
Dr. David Hawkins, he's a psychiatrist, and he studied emotions for a long time. And he said that, and I'm basing this on his research, I didn't just come up with this. He said that courage is the door where you start living in truth versus falsehood. And so that's the crank of life. And so that's a big piece of what we do. That's a big piece of what I'm focused on. People who come to Wild Awana Center are sick and tired of being sick. They're sick and tired. They're in a lot of pain, and they are ready to jump into the next phase of their life. But you know what? It's not free to do that. They have to. Anything that's worth having is scary. And so these people who come here are like, you know what? I'm going to start being honest. I'm going to start coming out of the dark, and then that's where transformation happens. And I think that one of the problems with traditional therapy is that traditional therapy doesn't push courage. It pushes validation, which is important. But courage is really where you get teeth to really grind through and create change.
Wow, that's good. Another issue that trips up men a lot is father-son relationships. I cannot tell you how many men I've talked to. Well, let me just say it differently. When I go into a room and I ask the men to raise their hands, how many of you had a great relationship with your father? Almost nobody raises their hand. But if I say how many had a troubled relationship with your father, most of the men raise their hands. And it goes the other way too. They have trouble being a son, and they have trouble being a father to their own sons. And to me, that's really sad, but it's also sort of the source of some of the other issues. Can you talk to someone about that?
Yeah, in terms of kind of what I do with fathers and sons, or what in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Yeah, I think that something that I really enjoy doing is helping fathers and sons go through have some sort of initiatory practice. Again, we've lost touch with our ancestry. We've lost touch with what fathers and sons have done for 99.9% of human history. I mean, back in the day, I mean, fathers and sons would work the farm together. Even before that, we were in tribes together. And since the Industrial Revolution, there's been a separation of father-son, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. So I think father-sons, I wouldn't encourage trying to talk to a teenager, for example, is a very difficult thing to do. So it's important to kind of find nonverbal approaches to connect, some sort of hobby, some sort of thing like that. But what I do here at the center is I found that sometimes when a teenager is resistant to talking, the cold always gets them talking, because it's a challenge. And when a father-son have to brave the elements together, it bonds them. And so then they're in there, and then they both kind of push their limits together. And what we do is we go cold tub, hot tub, cold tub. And in that process, we talk through things as the cold brings up vulnerabilities, it brings up fears, and then it just gives another way to talk. So in other words, finding ways to kind of come in the back door with kids, father, son, but to not, talking face to face and saying, how's your day? How are you feeling? there's limited return on that approach for most father sons. So you got to get creative.
Well, and also, I mean, that's just the macho type interchange, and it goes really nowhere, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I would say that a lot of my work has been to persuade men that there's a value in this approach that you and I are talking about, that there's something to be gained by being vulnerable and learning about yourself and opening up in your relationships and being more genuine and authentic. Can you just talk about what you would see as the advantages or the benefits and payoff of all this?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think we all have to consider the end of our lives. And Eric Erickson, the great developmental psychologist, studied life stages of life and found that so there's kind of 8 stages of life, and the last stage of life is when you're 60 plus. You're going to want to answer a very simple question: are you content with how your life is? Are you content with your love, with your generativity, and with your purpose? And either you end your life with integrity or you end it in despair. So if people can get a vision, which we don't tend to think about this in our culture, we tend to not think about the end. We try to avoid it, but just imagine, and I think that this is a very good definition of what hell is. To get to the end of your life and for God to show you the life you could have had, the people you could have loved, the person you could have been. But now it's too late. You missed the window. But then you get a vision of the person you could have been if you had the courage to be honest, to be humble, humility, to be vulnerable, to admit you need help. And I think that sometimes the human psyche needs pain, enough pain to push us in that. So what I have people do sometimes is visualize and do a death meditation where, like, you know what, you're going to die. You want to die with dignity. And so that right there is a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about your life, because you don't know how long you have. And so learning to be vulnerable, learning to talk about your feelings will prevent you from ending your life in despair. And you don't want to do that, because then it's really too late, and you're going to be like, man, I wish I could go back, but you can't do anything. So I would encourage people to consider that outcome, and then you'll feel adrenaline released, and then you'll be like, okay, I need to act. And I think that we need adrenaline and fear to act. And so you just have to activate adrenaline.
Yeah. Well, pretty good. Well, Bill, I thank you for your time. Bill Wilder from the Wilder Wellness Center in Mooresville, wilderwellnesscenter.com, right? So,
yes. And also, I would just say this to your listeners: if there's anybody who's interested in this, I am offering this time complimentary assessments where you can come and do a complimentary assessment for an hour. You can do it over Zoom or in person, and then I can then introduce you to see if there's any services at the center that could be of service to you.
Yeah. Bill, thank you for your time. Enjoyed it. Let's do it again sometime.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jerry.